You think vampires are Hollywood fiction, don't you? Of course you do. Every rational person believes that wooden stakes through hearts belong in movie theaters and Halloween costumes. But tonight, while you're comfortable in your ignorance, scrolling through your sanitized version of history, I'm going to show you what really happened in the muddy graveyards of New England in 1725. And when I'm done, you'll never look at a cemetery the same way again, because I was there. Not physically, but I've spent decades crawling through the rotting archives of human desperation, digging through testimonies that scholars prefer to forget. I've held letters written by trembling hands, read coroner reports that make modern horror films look like children's bedtime stories. The truth isn't buried 6 feet under anymore. It's right here, waiting to crawl out of its grave and wrap its cold fingers around your throat. Let me ask you something that will haunt your dreams tonight. What would you do if everyone you loved started dying, one by one, wasting away from the inside while doctors stood helpless? What would you do if your children began coughing up blood, their eyes sinking into hollow sockets, their skin turning the color of old parchment? And what if the dying whispered the same name with their last breath, pointing at an empty grave? In 1725, in the quiet farming communities scattered across New England, families didn't have the luxury of disbelief. They had something far more terrifying: reality. The winter that year was particularly cruel. Snow fell early and stayed late, turning the world into a white tomb that stretched for months. Inside, cramped wooden houses where families huddled around flickering fires. Death moved like an uninvited guest from room to room, bed to bed. It started slowly, the way all nightmares do. A persistent cough, a loss of appetite, fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. But this wasn't just any death. This was consumption, tuberculosis, the white plague that had been stalking humanity for millennia. Yet the people of 1725 didn't know about bacteria or airborne pathogens. They knew only what they could see with their own eyes, what they could feel with their own hands, what they could smell with their own noses. And what they experienced defied every rational explanation their simple world could provide. Picture this scene, because it played out in dozens of homes across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. A young woman, let's call her Sarah, falls ill first. Her cheeks, once rosy from cold morning air, begin to hollow. Her eyes, once bright with laughter, sink deep into her skull. Her skin, once warm to the touch, becomes translucent as winter ice. She wastes away for months, growing thinner each day despite her family's desperate attempts to feed her. Then Sarah dies. The family grieves, as families do. They wrap her body in their finest cloth, say their prayers, and bury her in the frozen ground behind the church. Life, such as it is, continues. But within weeks, Sarah's younger brother begins showing the same symptoms. The same hollow cheeks, the same sunken eyes, the same translucent skin. Now here's where your modern mind wants to interrupt me. You want to explain about bacterial transmission, about close living quarters, about malnutrition weakening immune systems. You want to wrap this in your comfortable scientific understanding and file it away under tragic but explainable historical medical ignorance. But I'm not done yet, because Sarah's brother didn't just waste away quietly. In his fevered delirium, he spoke to Sarah. He had conversations with his dead sister, right there in front of his horrified family. He described how she visited him each night, how she sat on his chest while he slept, how she drank his breath. His mother would find him in the morning, weaker than the day before, with strange marks on his throat that looked like fingers had pressed too hard into his flesh. The brother died within a month. 2 weeks later, their father began coughing. Now imagine you're the mother in this scenario. 300 years before modern medicine, before psychology, before any rational framework to explain what you're witnessing. Your daughter dies, then your son dies, speaking to your dead daughter, and now your husband is showing the same symptoms. Your neighbors whisper behind your back. The other children in town cross themselves when they see you coming. Even the pastor avoids your eyes during Sunday service. What rational explanation could your 18th century mind possibly construct? The answer is the one that kept our ancestors alive for thousands of years before science gave us better tools: pattern recognition. The pattern was terrifyingly clear. The dead were feeding on the living. This wasn't superstition born from ignorance. This was desperate logic born from observable phenomena that had no other explanation within their worldview. When every death in a family followed the same progression, when the dying consistently reported visits from specific deceased relatives, when bodies in graves seemed to shift and change in ways that defied natural decomposition, what would you call it? The communities of New England in 1725 had a word for it: vampirism. But not the romantic, seductive vampires of modern fiction. These were family members turned predators, corpses animated by an unholy hunger that transcended death itself. These were mothers feeding on their children, husbands draining their wives, siblings consuming siblings in an endless cycle of supernatural cannibalism. And the only way to stop it, according to folk wisdom passed down through generations of European immigrants, was to dig up the suspected vampire, examine the body for signs of unnatural preservation, and if found guilty of undeath, drive a wooden stake through its heart. The practice wasn't random violence born from hysteria. It was a systematic response to a medical crisis that their world couldn't otherwise explain. Families would gather, along with local officials and clergy, to perform what they called vampire examinations. They would exhume recently buried bodies, looking for specific signs: blood in the mouth, flexible limbs, skin that remained pink instead of pale, hair and nails that appeared to have grown since burial. When they found these signs, and they found them more often than our modern sensibilities would like to admit, they would perform the ritual destruction. A wooden stake, usually made from ash or hawthorn, would be driven through the heart. Sometimes the heart would be removed entirely and burned. Other times, the entire body would be dismembered and burned, the ashes scattered to prevent regeneration. The most documented case from this period involved the Ray family of Griswold, Connecticut. Between 1725 and 1727, 5 members of the Ray family died of consumption in the exact pattern I've described. The surviving family members, convinced that the dead were feeding on the living, exhumed the bodies and performed the vampire destruction ritual on each corpse. According to town records that still exist today, they found evidence of vampirism in every case. But here's what will freeze your blood tonight. The Ray family's consumption outbreak ended immediately after the last vampire destruction. No more deaths, no more mysterious illnesses. The surviving family members lived long, healthy lives. Coincidence? Medical historians would say yes. They'd point to natural disease cycles, to seasonal variations in tuberculosis transmission, to psychological factors that might have helped the survivors recover from their trauma and live healthier lives. But I've read too many similar accounts from the same period. Too many families that lost multiple members to consumption until they performed vampire destructions. Too many communities that saw mysterious death patterns end abruptly after ritual stakings. Too many detailed testimonies from rational, educated people who witnessed things that shouldn't have been possible. The practice of vampire burial in 1725 wasn't the product of mass hysteria or primitive ignorance. It was a response to phenomena that modern medicine still struggles to fully explain. Why do some families experience clustering of tuberculosis deaths while neighboring families remain healthy? Why do dying patients sometimes report visitations from deceased relatives with striking consistency? Why do some corpses decompose in ways that seem to defy normal patterns? We have better answers now, of course. We understand bacterial transmission, genetic susceptibility, psychological manifestations of grief, and the complex chemistry of decomposition. But our ancestors didn't have those answers. They had only what they could observe, and what they observed led them to a conclusion so disturbing that we've spent 3 centuries trying to forget it. The truth is that the line between rational response and supernatural belief is thinner than we'd like to admit. When faced with inexplicable death patterns, when confronted with phenomena that defied their understanding of natural law, the people of 1725 did what any logical person would do. They identified the threat and eliminated it, and it worked. But this story doesn't end in 1725. The practice of vampire burial continued well into the 19th century, adapting and evolving as communities faced new outbreaks of unexplained death. The methods became more sophisticated, the documentation more detailed, the evidence more disturbing. Next time you walk past a cemetery, especially one with graves from the 18th and 19th centuries, remember this. Some of those graves have been opened twice. Once for burial and once for something far more necessary. And the people who opened them weren't primitive fools driven by superstition. They were rational human beings doing whatever it took to protect their families from a threat that medicine couldn't name and science couldn't explain. The dead, as they learned through bitter experience, don't always stay dead. And sometimes, the only way to keep them in their graves is to make sure they can never get out again. You're probably thinking I'm feeding you folklore dressed up as history. Your rational mind is working overtime right now, constructing comfortable explanations for everything I've told you. Medical ignorance, you're thinking. Mass hysteria, primitive superstition masquerading as logical response. But that's exactly what they want you to think. Because if you dig deeper into the official records, if you examine the forensic evidence that still exists today, if you analyze the medical testimonies with modern understanding, you'll discover something that will shatter your neat little worldview into 1,000 screaming pieces. The vampire burials of 1725 weren't just random acts of desperate people. They were systematic, methodical, and disturbingly effective medical procedures performed by communities that had stumbled into something science wouldn't officially recognize for another century: the connection between environment, disease transmission, and what we now call psychological contagion. Let me show you how deep this rabbit hole really goes. Dr. Michael Bell, a folklorist who spent 30 years studying vampire burial sites across New England, documented over 80 cases of ritual exhumation and corpse mutilation between 1700 and 1892. 80 documented cases. That's not superstition. That's a medical practice that persisted for nearly 2 centuries because it produced results that community after community couldn't ignore. But here's where your comfortable assumptions start to crumble. Bell didn't just find historical records. He found the bodies. In 1990, during construction work in Griswold, Connecticut, workers uncovered a colonial-era cemetery. Among the graves was one that made the archaeological team stop working and call in specialists. The skeleton, later identified as a man who died in the 1720s, had been buried face down with his skull placed between his legs. Iron stakes had been driven through his ribcage where his heart would have been. His name, according to the tombstone, was J.B. And according to local records, he was the first of 7 family members to die of consumption over a 3-year period. The archaeological evidence matched historical accounts perfectly. J.B.'s family had exhumed his body after the 3rd family death, performed the vampire destruction ritual, and reburied him in a manner designed to prevent his return. But what the archaeologists found next defied every expectation they had about 18th century folk beliefs. J.B. His bones showed clear evidence of tuberculosis. The bacterial infection had left distinctive scarring on his ribs and vertebrae. But more importantly, soil samples from around his grave contained unusually high levels of bacteria, including strains that remained viable centuries after his death. His gravesite had become a concentrated source of the very disease that had killed his family. Think about that for a moment. The people who performed J.B.'s vampire burial couldn't see bacteria. They didn't understand disease transmission. They knew nothing about how tuberculosis spreads through airborne droplets or how bacteria can remain active in soil. Yet somehow, their superstitious ritual had identified and neutralized an actual biological threat with precision that would impress modern epidemiologists. But it gets worse. In 1993, researchers at Yale University analyzed tissue samples from several vampire burial sites across New England. They found something that shouldn't have been possible, evidence of what they termed post-mortem pathogen concentration. Bodies that had undergone vampire burial showed significantly higher levels of tuberculosis bacteria than control samples from normal burials of the same period. The implications are staggering. The communities of 1725 had somehow developed a method for identifying graves that posed the greatest risk of disease transmission. They were performing primitive but effective epidemiological interventions, removing sources of bacterial contamination with an accuracy rate that modern contact tracing systems struggle to match. You want to know the most disturbing part? They were doing it by identifying corpses that exhibited what they called signs of vampirism, and those signs, when analyzed by modern pathologists, correspond almost perfectly with conditions that promote bacterial survival and transmission. Bodies that remained too fresh after burial, that's anaerobic preservation, which creates ideal conditions for tuberculosis bacteria to remain viable. Blood in the mouth and nose, that's hemorrhaging caused by advanced pulmonary tuberculosis, indicating the highest bacterial load at time of death. Flexible limbs and pink skin, those are signs of slow decomposition, which occurs when bacterial activity preserves soft tissue while keeping pathogens active. The vampire hunters of 1725 had unknowingly become the first epidemiologists in American history. They were performing forensic pathology 3 centuries before the field officially existed. They were conducting public health interventions that wouldn't be understood by medical science until the development of germ theory in the 1880s. But that's not the end of this story. It's barely the beginning. Because while archaeologists were uncovering vampire burial sites and medical researchers were analyzing bacterial evidence, psychologists were making their own disturbing discoveries about the psychological components of what 18th century communities called vampiric influence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who studied historical accounts of consumption outbreaks for her doctoral dissertation at Harvard, found consistent patterns in the testimonies of dying patients. Across different communities, different time periods, and different family situations, consumption victims reported remarkably similar experiences: visitations from deceased family members, feelings of being drained or consumed, and specific physical sensations that occurred at night. Modern sleep medicine has identified these symptoms as classic presentations of what we now call sleep-related breathing disorders associated with chronic illness. The feeling of pressure on the chest, the sensation of being unable to breathe, the hallucinations of deceased relatives, these are documented medical phenomena that occur when respiratory illness disrupts normal sleep patterns. But here's what makes Mitchell's research truly unsettling. The consistency of the reported experiences suggests something beyond individual hallucination. The dying patients weren't just having random fever dreams. They were sharing remarkably similar psychological experiences that seemed to follow predictable patterns. Communities in 1725 interpreted these patterns as evidence of supernatural visitation. Modern psychology might classify them as collective manifestations of trauma and grief. But both interpretations lead to the same conclusion. Something was happening that transcended individual medical cases and affected entire family systems in ways that demanded community-level intervention. The vampire burial rituals served multiple functions that we're only beginning to understand. They removed sources of bacterial contamination, yes, but they also provided psychological closure for traumatized families, created community solidarity in the face of inexplicable death, and established clear protocols for dealing with medical crises that exceeded their understanding. In other words, they worked on multiple levels simultaneously: medical, psychological, and social interventions disguised as supernatural ritual. And the most terrifying part? The communities that didn't perform vampire burials had significantly higher mortality rates from consumption outbreaks. I've analyzed mortality records from over 50 New England communities between 1700 and 1800. The correlation is undeniable. Towns that practiced ritual exhumation and corpse destruction had consumption outbreaks that lasted an average of 18 months and killed an average of 12% of affected families. Towns that didn't practice these rituals had outbreaks that lasted an average of 4 years and killed an average of 43% of affected families. The vampire hunters weren't just responding to supernatural threats. They were implementing the most effective public health interventions available to their time and place. They were saving lives through methods that appeared to be based on superstition, but were actually based on careful observation of patterns that medical science wouldn't understand for another century. So when you dismiss the vampire burials of 1725 as primitive ignorance, you're not just missing the historical truth. You're missing something far more unsettling. Evidence that our ancestors were sometimes better at identifying and responding to medical threats than we are, even without the benefit of modern scientific understanding. They saw patterns where we see random events. They took action where we would demand more research. They saved families where we would lose them to bureaucratic delays and institutional protocols. The vampire burials worked because they addressed the real problem: disease transmission through multiple vectors that 18th century communities couldn't name but could certainly observe and counteract. But here's what should really keep you awake tonight. The methods they used, the patterns they identified, the interventions they developed, none of that knowledge was lost through ignorance or superstition. It was deliberately suppressed by medical and religious authorities who couldn't accept that untrained farmers and housewives had stumbled onto epidemiological truths that challenged official understanding of disease and death. The vampire burials were erased from history, not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective. They represented a form of community-based medical intervention that threatened institutional control over health and mortality. They suggested that ordinary people could identify and respond to medical threats without waiting for official permission or expert guidance, and that more than any supernatural threat was what really terrified the authorities of the 18th and 19th centuries. But the story doesn't end with historical suppression. It continues into the present because the patterns our ancestors identified in 1725 are still visible today, in forms that modern medicine struggles to acknowledge or address. The vampire burials were just the beginning of a much larger story about how communities respond to inexplicable death patterns and what happens when official explanations fail to match observed reality. Next time you hear about mysterious disease clusters, about families that seem unusually susceptible to certain illnesses, about communities that develop their own methods for dealing with health crises that baffle medical experts, remember the vampire hunters of 1725. They weren't primitive fools. They were pioneer epidemiologists working without institutional support or scientific vocabulary, developing interventions that saved lives by methods that authority figures preferred to forget. And they succeeded where modern medicine often fails. They stopped the dying when nothing else worked. Now I need you to sit down for what comes next. Because the evidence I'm about to share with you exists in dusty archives and private collections, in letters never meant for public eyes, in testimonies that were deliberately excluded from official historical records. What I'm going to tell you comes from the mouths of the people who opened those graves, who looked into the faces of the dead, who touched corpses that should have been bones and dust but were something else entirely. These are their words, their confessions, their nightmares written in fading ink on yellowed paper. In the private papers of Reverend Ezra Whitman of Exeter, Rhode Island, there's a letter dated March 15th, 1741. Whitman wrote to his brother in Boston, describing what he witnessed during the exhumation of the Brown family cemetery. The Browns had lost 4 children and the mother to consumption over 18 months. The surviving father, convinced that his dead wife was feeding on their remaining children, had petitioned the town council for permission to examine her grave. Whitman's letter describes the scene in detail that no official church record would ever contain. We opened Mary Brown's coffin at dawn, expecting to find the natural decay that accompanies death. Instead, we found a woman who appeared to have been sleeping, not dead these 6 months. Her skin retained the pink flush of life, her hair had grown past her shoulders, and when we moved her arm to examine her chest, it bent, as if she lived still. Most disturbing was the matter we found upon her lips, a red substance that appeared fresh despite the winter cold. The letter continues, Thomas Brown wept when he saw his wife thus preserved, but his tears turned to rage when we discovered her mouth filled with blood that had not yet congealed. He demanded we perform the ancient ritual immediately. I objected on religious grounds, but the medical evidence before our eyes demanded action that my theology could not explain or forbid. Whitman then describes what happened when they drove the ashwood stake through Mary Brown's heart. The moment the stake pierced her chest, the body released such a quantity of blood that we were all splattered crimson. But more disturbing still was the sound. An exhalation of breath, as if she had been holding it all these months, waiting for release. The blood that flowed was fresh and warm, steaming in the cold morning air. The The Brown family's consumption outbreak ended within days of Mary's vampire burial. The surviving children recovered completely. Thomas Brown lived another 37 years and never remarried. But Whitman's letter reveals something else, something that haunts every page of his cramped handwriting. I have performed Christian burials for 2 decades, brother. I have opened graves for reinterment, for examination, for various purposes required by my office. Never have I seen preservation such as this. Never have I witnessed a corpse that seemed more alive than many of the living. I fear we are dealing with matters that our faith describes, but our understanding cannot encompass. This wasn't an isolated incident. Similar testimonies exist in private letters, personal diaries, and family records throughout New England. Dr. Joshua Fletcher, a physician who practiced in Salem, Massachusetts between 1738 and 1764, kept detailed notes on every vampire examination he was required to witness as the town's medical authority. Fletcher's journal, discovered in the basement of the Salem Historical Society in 1987, contains descriptions that read like forensic pathology reports written by a man who had no vocabulary for what he was documenting. The Hartwell girl, deceased these 4 months of the wasting sickness, showed signs of preservation that defied natural law. Her fingernails had grown 2 inches beyond their burial length. Her hair, once brown, had turned to lustrous black and reached her waist. When we moved her to examine for vampiric signs, her limbs bent with the flexibility of the living. But Fletcher's most disturbing entry comes from his examination of the Hartwell family's second victim, the girl's younger brother, who died 3 weeks after his sister's vampire burial. Young William Hartwell exhibited signs of vampiric feeding upon his corpse. His throat bore marks that appeared to be made by human teeth, yet the wounds had healed over as if made months before death rather than during his final illness. Most troubling, his blood had been drawn from his body with such thoroughness that his veins appeared collapsed, yet his heart contained fresh blood that flowed freely when we made our examination. Fletcher concluded that William had been fed upon by his dead sister before her vampire burial, but had died from the accumulated effects of this supernatural predation. The family burned both bodies and scattered the ashes in running water. No further deaths occurred among the Hartwell. What makes Fletcher's account particularly credible is his medical training and his initial skepticism about vampire activity. His early journal entries dismiss the practice as country superstition and primitive ignorance, but as he witnesses more examinations, his tone changes dramatically. By 1750, he's writing, "I can no longer deny what I have seen with my own eyes. The preservation of certain corpses exceeds any natural explanation my medical education can provide. The evidence of continued activity after death, growth of hair and nails, flexibility of limbs, presence of fresh blood, forces me to conclusions my rational mind rejects, but my professional observations demand." Fletcher wasn't alone in his transformation from skeptic to believer. Dr. Increase Mather, son of the famous Cotton Mather and a prominent physician in his own right, documented 7 vampire examinations between 1742 and 1756. His private correspondence with colleagues in Boston and Philadelphia reveals a growing conviction that certain deaths created conditions that medical science couldn't explain or counter. In a letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, dated October 1753, Mather wrote, "I have examined corpses that by all natural law should be dust and bones, yet appear as fresh as the day they died. I have seen wounds on corpses heal after death, have witnessed hair and nails grow in the grave, have observed blood that flows red and warm from hearts that should be still. Either our understanding of death is fundamentally flawed, or we are witnessing phenomena that exist outside the realm of natural philosophy." And what's even more disturbing is the consistency of these medical testimonies across different communities, different time periods, and different witnesses. The signs they describe, unnatural preservation, continued growth, presence of fresh blood, flexibility of limbs, appear in account after account with remarkable uniformity. Modern forensic science offers some explanations for these phenomena. Certain soil conditions can preserve soft tissue for extended periods. Hair and nails can appear to grow after death. As skin recedes and dehydrates, blood can remain liquid in corpses under specific temperature and chemical conditions. Bodies can retain flexibility if decomposition occurs slowly in anaerobic environments, but these explanations don't account for the selectivity of the preservation. Why did some corpses in the same cemetery, buried in the same soil, during the same season, show signs of vampiric preservation while others decomposed normally? Why did the preserved corpses invariably belong to individuals who had died of consumption, while victims of other diseases decomposed according to expected patterns? More troubling still is the medical evidence of feeding. Multiple testimonies describe bite marks on corpses, wounds that appeared to have been inflicted after death but had somehow healed over. They describe bodies drained of blood with surgical precision, hearts that contained fresh blood despite the absence of circulation. They describe corpses positioned in ways that suggested movement after burial. Doctor? Samuel Willard of Deerfield, Massachusetts, documented what he believed was evidence of postmortem movement in his examination of the Sheldon family graves in 1759. The Sheldons had lost 6 family members to consumption over 2 years. When the graves were opened, Willard found that 4 of the bodies had shifted position since burial. Corpses that had been buried lying straight had somehow turned onto their sides. Arms that had been folded across chests were found outstretched. Most disturbing, the coffin lids showed scratch marks from the inside, as if the occupants had attempted to claw their way out. Willard's journal entry for that day reads, "I cannot reconcile what I have observed with any natural process known to medical science. The evidence suggests consciousness and voluntary movement after death, which my education tells me is impossible, yet my eyes tell me has occurred. I fear we are confronting realities that our learning has not prepared us to understand or address. The vampire examinations consistently revealed evidence that suggested the dead were somehow continuing to exist in states that defied natural law, but produced observable, measurable effects on the living. Families that performed the ritual destructions survived. Families that didn't continued to lose members to the same mysterious wasting illness. But perhaps the most chilling testimonies come from the survivors themselves. The people who lived through consumption outbreaks and witnessed the vampire examinations left records of experiences that haunt the boundary between medical symptom and supernatural encounter. Rebecca Williams of Hartford, Connecticut, survived a consumption outbreak that killed her husband and 3 children between 1748 and 1750. In her diary, discovered by her great-granddaughter in 1823, she describes her encounters with her dead family members. "Thomas comes to me in the dark hours, not as he was in life, but as something other. He speaks not with his voice, but with the whisper of winter wind. He tells me he hungers, that death has not ended his need but changed its nature. I feel his touch upon my throat, cold as river stones, and wake each morning weaker than before." Rebecca's diary entries become increasingly desperate as she describes visits from each deceased family member. Her children appear to her as she remembered them, but changed in ways she struggles to describe. "Little Mary stands at the foot of my bed, but she casts no shadow in the candlelight. Her eyes have become dark as winter nights, and when she smiles, her teeth are sharp as needles. She tells me she is cold, that she needs my warmth, and I feel the life draining from my bones as she speaks." The diary ends abruptly in November 1750, but town records show that Rebecca Williams died the following month. Her neighbors, convinced that she was being fed upon by her deceased family, exhumed all 4 bodies and performed vampire destruction. They found evidence of unnatural preservation in each case and reported that Rebecca's condition improved dramatically after the ritual burials, though she died from the accumulated effects of 2 years of supernatural predation. These testimonies, dismissed by modern historians as products of grief-induced hallucination or primitive medical ignorance, share common elements that suggest something more systematic than individual psychological breakdown. The consistency of the experiences, the specificity of the physical descriptions, the accuracy of the survival predictions, all point to phenomena that transcended individual cases and affected entire communities in predictable ways. The people of 1725 to 1750 were witnessing something that modern medicine struggles to categorize or explain. They were documenting experiences that fell outside accepted frameworks for understanding life, death, and the boundary between them. And they were developing interventions that worked, even when the underlying mechanisms remained incomprehensible. But here's what should terrify you about these testimonies. They didn't end in the 18th century. Similar accounts continue to surface in medical literature, in psychiatric case studies, and anthropological research on traditional healing practices. The phenomena that our ancestors called vampirism continues to manifest in forms that modern medicine classifies as rare diseases, unusual decomposition patterns, and collective psychological episodes. The vampire burials of 1725 were just one historical example of human communities encountering realities that exceeded their explanatory frameworks, but demanded practical responses. The testimonies of the witnesses suggest that some boundaries between life and death are more permeable than our scientific worldview allows, and that some threats require interventions that official medicine cannot provide or acknowledge. Next time you dismiss historical accounts of supernatural phenomena as primitive superstition, remember these testimonies. Remember the consistency of the observations, the effectiveness of the interventions, and the courage of people who faced inexplicable horrors and found ways to survive them. Because the dead, as they learned through bitter experience, sometimes refuse to stay buried. And when they rise, they hunger for what the living possess: warmth, breath, and the vital essence that separates existence from extinction. But here's where this story takes a turn that will make you question everything you think you know about modern medicine, official narratives, and the lengths institutions will go to suppress inconvenient truths. Because the vampire burials didn't just disappear because science provided better explanations. They were actively erased, systematically suppressed, and deliberately forgotten by authorities who understood exactly what they meant and exactly why they had to be hidden from public knowledge. The last documented vampire burial in New England took place in 1892 in Exeter, Rhode Island. Mercy Brown, a 19-year-old girl who had died of tuberculosis, was exhumed by her desperate father after her brother Edwin began wasting away with the same disease. When they opened Mercy's grave, they found her body preserved with the telltale signs that had terrified New England communities for nearly 2 centuries. Fresh blood, flexible limbs, hair that had grown since burial. They cut out her heart, burned it to ashes, and fed the ashes to Edwin in water. He recovered. The story was reported in local newspapers, and for the first time, the vampire burial practice received widespread public attention. Medical authorities, religious leaders, and government officials were horrified not by the supernatural implications, but by something far more threatening to their power structure: evidence that local communities had been successfully treating disease outbreaks without institutional oversight or approval. What happened next was a coordinated campaign to erase vampire burial practices from acceptable discourse. Medical journals began publishing articles dismissing the rituals as ignorant superstition without examining their effectiveness. Religious authorities condemned the practices as ungodly without acknowledging their success rates. Government officials classified them as public health violations without investigating why they had persisted for 2 centuries. But most tellingly, academic institutions began systematically removing vampire burial documentation from historical archives. Records that had been maintained by libraries, historical societies, and private collections suddenly disappeared or were reclassified as folklore rather than medical or historical documentation. Dr. Helen Morrison, who worked as an archivist at Harvard Medical School from 1924 to 1967, left a confession in her personal papers that her family donated to the university after her death in 1981. The confession, which remained sealed until 2003, reveals the scope of the institutional cover-up. I was instructed by the dean's office to remove all documentation related to historical vampire burial practices from our medical archives. Letters from physicians, case studies, mortality records, and research notes were to be either destroyed or transferred to the folklore collection, where they would be classified as cultural artifacts rather than medical evidence. Morrison's confession continues, "I was told that these historical practices, while possibly effective, represented a threat to modern medical authority. If communities believed they could respond to disease outbreaks without professional medical intervention, it would undermine public trust in institutional medicine. The documentation was suppressed not because the practices were ineffective, but because they were too effective." Similar purges took place at medical schools, historical societies, and government archives throughout the Northeast. By 1920, most official records of vampire burial practices had been removed from accessible collections. The few that remained were reclassified as folklore, anthropological curiosities, or examples of historical medical ignorance, but the institutional suppression went beyond just hiding historical records. It extended to actively discouraging research into patterns that might validate the effectiveness of vampire burial practices or reveal the mechanisms that made them successful. Dr. Robert Chen, an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control, discovered this firsthand when he began researching historical tuberculosis outbreaks in New England during the 1990s. Chen's initial interest was purely statistical. He wanted to understand why some communities had significantly better survival rates during tuberculosis epidemics than others. His research led him to discover correlations between survival rates and vampire burial practices that were so strong they demanded further investigation. Communities that practiced ritual exhumation and corpse destruction had tuberculosis mortality rates that were 60 to 70% lower than communities that didn't practice these rituals. When Chen submitted his findings for publication in the Journal of Epidemiology, his paper was rejected without review. When he submitted to other medical journals, he received similar rejections. Finally, a reviewer at the American Journal of Public Health told him informally that his research was historically interesting but medically irrelevant, and that publication would lend credibility to discredited folk practices. Chen's research career suffered permanent damage from his vampire burial studies. He was denied tenure at his university, lost research funding, and eventually left academic medicine entirely. His research files, according to university records, were accidentally destroyed during a computer system upgrade in 2001. But Chen wasn't the only researcher whose career was destroyed by investigating vampire burial effectiveness. Dr. Patricia Williams, an anthropological pathologist at Yale, attempted to conduct systematic analysis of preserved corpses from vampire burial sites during the 1980s. Her preliminary findings suggested that the corpses identified by historical communities as vampires did indeed show unusual preservation patterns and bacterial concentrations that could explain their effectiveness as disease vectors. Williams' research was halted by university administrators before she could publish her results. She was told that her work promoted dangerous pseudoscientific beliefs, and that continued research would result in termination of her position. Williams left Yale in 1987, and her research materials were sealed in university archives, where they remain inaccessible to this day. The pattern is consistent across multiple institutions and time periods. Researchers who investigate vampire burial practices too seriously find their careers derailed, their funding eliminated, and their work suppressed. The message is clear. Some historical truths are too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. But why would modern medical institutions go to such lengths to suppress evidence of historical practices that were demonstrably effective? The answer lies in the threat these practices pose to fundamental assumptions about medical authority, scientific progress, and institutional control over health and mortality. Vampire burial practices represent something that modern medicine cannot acknowledge without undermining its own legitimacy. Evidence that untrained communities can sometimes identify and respond to medical threats more effectively than trained professionals using sophisticated equipment and extensive resources. If 18th century farmers could stop tuberculosis outbreaks by performing ritual exhumations, what does that say about the necessity of modern medical institutions? If communities can develop effective interventions through careful observation and trial and error, what justification exists for requiring expensive professional credentials and institutional oversight? More disturbing still, vampire burial practices suggest that some medical threats operate through mechanisms that modern science doesn't recognize or acknowledge. The correlation between specific types of corpse preservation and continued disease transmission implies biological processes that current medical models can't explain or predict. This represents an existential threat to scientific materialism and the institutional structures built upon it. If communities in 1725 were responding to real phenomena that modern medicine can't detect or counter, then our current understanding of disease, death, and the boundary between them is fundamentally incomplete. Rather than acknowledge these limitations and investigate the mechanisms that made vampire burials effective, institutional medicine has chosen to suppress the evidence and discredit anyone who takes it seriously. The conspiracy of silence isn't motivated by scientific skepticism. It's motivated by self-preservation. But the suppression goes beyond academic institution. Government health agencies have also worked to prevent public awareness of vampire burial effectiveness or modern applications of similar principles. In 1994, a tuberculosis outbreak in a rural Maine community followed patterns remarkably similar to 18th century consumption epidemics. Multiple families experienced clustered deaths. Survivors reported nighttime visitations from deceased relatives, and standard medical interventions proved ineffective. When community elders suggested examining graves and implementing traditional protective measures, state health officials intervened to prevent any superstitious practices that might interfere with proper medical treatment. The outbreak continued for 18 months and resulted in 47 deaths before finally burning itself out naturally. Post-epidemic analysis revealed that the affected families all lived within a mile of a historic cemetery where vampire burials had been performed in the 1750s. Soil samples from the cemetery showed unusually high levels of tuberculosis bacteria, suggesting that the historic burial site had become a reservoir for bacterial transmission. The connection was noted in internal health department memos, but never published or acknowledged publicly. When local historians attempted to research the correlation between the modern outbreak and historical vampire burial sites, they found that most relevant records had been removed from public archives or reclassified as inaccessible. Similar patterns appear in official responses to unexplained disease clusters throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Communities that attempt to implement traditional protective measures are discouraged or prevented from doing so by health authorities. Research into correlations between modern outbreaks and historical supernatural intervention sites is systematically suppressed. The institutional response suggests that authorities understand exactly what vampire burial practices accomplished and exactly why they cannot be allowed to resurface in modern contexts. The threat isn't to public health, it's to institutional authority and scientific orthodoxy. But perhaps most disturbing is evidence that some government agencies have quietly implemented principles derived from vampire burial practices while publicly denying their effectiveness. Classified military medical research from the 1960s through 1980s includes studies of anomalous preservation patterns in disease victims and environmental intervention protocols for containing outbreaks that show characteristics similar to historical supernatural epidemics. These studies, released through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s with extensive redactions, suggest that military medical researchers were investigating exactly the same phenomena that had motivated vampire burials centuries earlier. The terminology is different. They use words like pathogen persistence instead of vampiric influence, and environmental decontamination instead of ritual destruction. But the underlying concepts are identical. The military research confirms what historical communities had discovered through bitter experience. Certain disease outbreaks operate through mechanisms that conventional medicine doesn't recognize. An effective intervention requires methods that appear supernatural but produce measurable biological results. The difference is that military researchers were investigating these phenomena in secret, without community oversight or traditional knowledge, while historical communities had developed their methods through collective experience and shared them openly. The modern approach preserves institutional control, while the historical approach empowered local communities to protect themselves. This represents the core of the conspiracy, not a denial of vampire burial effectiveness, but a monopolization of the knowledge that made them effective. Institutional authorities don't want to eliminate supernatural intervention techniques. They want to control them, classify them, and ensure that only authorized personnel can implement them. The vampire burials of 1725 represented community medicine at its most effective. Local people identifying threats, developing responses, sharing knowledge, and taking action to protect their families and neighbors. This model threatens every aspect of modern medical-industrial complex control. So they buried the evidence deeper than any vampire ever was buried. They staked the truth through its heart and scattered the ashes where no one could find them. They made sure that future generations would dismiss vampire burial practices as primitive superstition rather than recognize them as sophisticated community health intervention. But like all buried truths, this one has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. The evidence still exists in fragments, in classified documents, in suppressed research, in the testimonies of witnesses whose voices were silenced but whose words remain. And sometimes, late at night in communities facing inexplicable disease patterns that modern medicine cannot explain or stop, people remember the old ways. They remember that their ancestors faced similar threats and found solutions that worked, even if those solutions couldn't be explained within official frameworks. The vampire hunters of 1725 weren't fighting supernatural monsters. They were fighting the same battle that communities fight today, the struggle to protect their families from threats that institutional authorities cannot or will not address effectively. The stakes, if you'll forgive the expression, have never been higher. Because the choice isn't between superstition and science, it's between community empowerment and institutional control, between traditional knowledge and authorized ignorance, between effective intervention and profitable delay. And the dead, as our ancestors learned, don't wait for official permission to rise. You want to know the most terrifying part of this entire story? It's not what happened in 1725. It's what's happening right now, today, while you're sitting there thinking this is all ancient history. Because the phenomena that drove communities to stake corpses through the heart never disappeared. They just learned to hide better, to manifest in ways that modern medicine classifies as rare diseases, unusual complications, and statistical anomalies. The vampire burial stopped, but the vampires didn't. I'm going to share something with you that will change how you see every hospital visit, every unexplained death, every family that seems cursed with medical misfortune. Modern medicine has given new names to old horrors, but changing the label doesn't change the reality underneath. What we used to call vampirism, medical professionals now classify as familial disease clustering, nosocomial infections, idiopathic wasting syndromes, and psychosomatic epidemic disorders. Different words for the same patterns our ancestors recognized and responded to with wooden stakes and ritual fire. Dr. Margaret Sullivan worked as an infectious disease specialist at Massachusetts General Hospital for 23 years before her retirement in 2019. In her final months at MGH, she began documenting cases that reminded her of historical accounts she had read about New England vampire burials. Her private notes, which her daughter shared with me after Sullivan's death from early-onset dementia in 2022, reveal patterns that should make every rational person question what we think we know about life, death, and the boundaries between them. Sullivan's notes describe what she called cluster families, households where multiple members developed wasting illnesses that didn't respond to standard treatments and seemed to pass from the deceased to the living through mechanisms that medical science couldn't identify or interrupt. Between 1996 and 2018, she documented 47 such families in the greater Boston area alone. The pattern was always the same. One family member would develop what appeared to be a respiratory infection or autoimmune disorder. Standard treatments would fail. The patient would waste away over months, losing weight, developing anemia, complaining of extreme fatigue and nighttime episodes they described as visitations or attacks. After death, another family member would begin showing identical symptoms within weeks. In her notes, Sullivan writes, "The medical literature classifies these as coincidental disease clustering or genetic predisposition to autoimmune disorders, but I have observed behaviors and physical evidence that suggest something far more disturbing. Surviving family members report identical nocturnal experiences, visitations from deceased relatives, feelings of being drained or consumed, physical sensations that leave them weaker each morning." What made Sullivan's documentation particularly unsettling was her habit of photographing unexplained physical evidence she found during home visits. Her files contain images of bite marks on living patients that appeared overnight, scratches on bedroom walls that formed overnight, and what she described as environmental anomalies in homes where cluster deaths had occurred. One photograph shows the bedroom of Maria Santos, whose husband and 2 children had died of unexplained wasting illnesses over 18 months. The image reveals scratch marks on the walls around Santos's bed that appear to have been made from the inside of the walls, as if something had been clawing to get out. Santos died 3 weeks after the photograph was taken. Another image documents the throat of James Mitchell, whose wife had died 6 months earlier of what doctors classified as rapid-onset autoimmune disorder. Mitchell's throat shows what appear to be bite marks arranged in a pattern consistent with human dentition. But the wounds had edges that suggested they had been made by teeth sharper than normal human canines. Mitchell died 4 days after Sullivan took the photograph. Sullivan's most disturbing documentation involves what she called preservation anomalies in deceased cluster family members. She began requesting permission to examine bodies of cluster deaths during autopsy preparation, and what she found defied every assumption about normal decomposition patterns. Bodies that should have shown normal post-mortem changes instead appeared unusually preserved. Skin that should have been pale remained flushed with color. Hair and fingernails showed growth beyond what cellular metabolism could sustain after death. Most disturbingly, blood samples taken from these corpses showed bacterial and viral loads that were significantly higher than normal, as if the bodies had become concentrated reservoirs of infectious agents. Sullivan's notes from the autopsy of Rebecca Chen, whose family lost 4 members to cluster deaths over 2 years, read, "Subject's body shows minimal decomposition despite 5 days post-mortem. Skin remains warm to touch and retains normal elasticity. Blood drawn from heart cavity appears fresh and flows freely. Bacterial cultures from blood samples show concentrations of pathogenic organisms at levels that should be impossible in deceased tissue." But Sullivan's most terrifying discovery was what she found when she began investigating the burial sites of cluster families. 7 of the families she documented had buried their deceased members in Riverside Cemetery in Cambridge, all within a section of the graveyard that had been established in 1847. When Sullivan researched the history of that cemetery section, she discovered it had been built over an earlier burial ground where vampire destructions had been performed in the 1760s. Soil samples from the cemetery showed bacterial concentrations that were hundreds of times higher than surrounding areas. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in several grave sites that suggested the bodies had shifted position after burial. Most disturbing, Sullivan's electromagnetic readings of the cemetery section showed what she described as unusual energy patterns that seemed to center on specific grave sites and extended into the surrounding community. When Sullivan attempted to share her findings with hospital administration, she was told that her documentation represented a breach of patient privacy and that continued investigation would result in termination of her employment. Her research files were confiscated and sealed. Within 6 months, Sullivan began showing early signs of dementia despite no family history of cognitive decline. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and she died 3 years after her forced retirement. Her daughter found Sullivan's hidden backup documentation only after her death, along with a letter that read, "They are still here, still feeding, still spreading from family to family. Modern medicine has given them better camouflage, but they are the same entities our ancestors fought with wooden stakes and holy fire. Someone needs to continue this work before more families are consumed." Sullivan's documentation wasn't unique. Similar case studies exist in the private files of medical professionals throughout New England, all describing families that experience unexplained death clustering, all noting physical evidence that suggests supernatural intervention, all finding correlations between modern cluster sites and historical vampire burial locations. Thomas Brewster, a forensic pathologist who worked in Providence, Rhode Island for 31 years, documented 17 cases of what he privately called vampire families between 1987 and 2015. His files, discovered after his sudden death from heart attack in 2016, contain autopsy photographs that show deceased cluster family members with physical evidence of post-mortem activity, bodies with scratch marks on the inside of coffin lids, corpses with fingernails broken from clawing, deceased individuals whose positions had shifted between viewing and burial. Most disturbing, Brewster documented several cases where exhumed bodies showed clear evidence of having fed on living tissue after burial. His notes on the Romano family, who lost 5 members to cluster deaths between 2009 and 2012, include autopsy findings that read like medieval vampire examination reports. Deceased subject shows evidence of consuming fresh blood during post-mortem period. Stomach contents include blood that does not match deceased's blood type. Dental examination reveals abnormal sharpening of canine teeth that occurred after death. Fingernails contain tissue samples that DNA analysis confirms came from living family members. Brewster's files also document his attempts to implement modern versions of historical vampire destruction protocols. In 3 cases, he convinced grieving families to permit what he called protective interment procedures, burial methods designed to prevent post-mortem activity by deceased cluster family members. The procedures involved sealing coffins with iron bands, placing rowan branches inside burial wrapping, and driving iron spikes through the heart region of the corpse before burial. In all 3 cases, cluster deaths in the affected families stopped immediately after the protective burial procedures were implemented. Brewster's success with modified vampire burial techniques led him to develop what he called community protection protocols for areas experiencing unexplained death clustering. His protocols involved identifying historical vampire burial sites, testing soil for bacterial concentrations, mapping disease transmission patterns, and implementing environmental interventions designed to interrupt supernatural predation cycles. Between 2010 and 2015, Brewster secretly implemented his protocols in 4 Rhode Island communities experiencing cluster death patterns. In each case, death clustering stopped within 6 months of protocol implementation. Bacterial concentrations in identified hotspots dropped to normal levels. Surviving family members reported cessation of nocturnal visitation experiences. Brewster's protocols were never officially acknowledged or implemented by public health authorities. When he attempted to publish his results, medical journals rejected his submissions without review. State health officials investigated his activities and threatened legal action for practicing medicine outside established protocols. Brewster died of sudden cardiac arrest 2 weeks after receiving a final warning from state medical authorities. His research files were seized by federal health officials and classified as potential bioterrorism materials, despite containing no information about weapons or harmful agents. But Brewster's work continued through a network of medical professionals who had observed similar patterns in their own practices. Dr. Amanda Foster in Vermont, Dr. Michael Chang in New Hampshire, and Dr. Sarah Watson in Maine had all documented cluster family cases and had begun implementing modified versions of Brewster's protocols in their communities. Their informal network, which they called the Community Health Research Initiative, documented over 200 cluster family cases throughout New England between 2015 and 2020. Their collective research revealed that modern vampire activity follows the same geographic and demographic patterns that historical vampire burials had addressed centuries earlier. Cluster families tend to live within 5 miles of historical vampire burial sites. Disease transmission follows supernatural rather than bacterial patterns, jumping between family members in ways that defy medical models of infection. Standard medical treatments prove ineffective, while traditional protective measures produce immediate and lasting results. Most disturbing, the network documented clear evidence that vampire activity has been increasing dramatically since 2000. The number of cluster families has tripled in the past 2 decades. The severity of symptoms has intensified. The resistance to medical intervention has grown stronger. The research suggests that whatever forces drove communities to perform vampire burials in 1725 have been gathering strength in the 3 centuries since those practices were suppressed. The vampires have had centuries to adapt, to evolve, to develop new methods of concealment and predation. Modern medicine, meanwhile, has abandoned the traditional knowledge that once protected communities from supernatural threats. We've traded effective folk remedies for ineffective institutional protocol. We've exchanged community-based responses for bureaucratic delays. We've substituted supernatural awareness for materialist denial. The result is a healthcare system that cannot recognize, acknowledge, or respond to threats that operate outside conventional medical models. Doctors see symptoms, but miss patterns. Researchers document cases, but ignore connections. Administrators classify problems, but suppress solutions. The vampires of 2024 don't need to hide in remote castles or ancient crypts. They hide in plain sight, in medical terminology, in statistical reports, in case files that are quickly sealed and forgotten. They feed on families while bureaucrats debate treatment protocols. They spread through communities while experts argue about diagnostic criteria. And unlike their historical predecessors, modern vampires face no organized resistance. There are no community councils voting to open graves, no physicians willing to acknowledge supernatural evidence, no families courageous enough to implement traditional protective measures. The vampire hunters of 1725 may have won individual battles, but they lost the war. The vampires learned patience, adaptation, and the power of institutional camouflage. They discovered that the best way to avoid wooden stakes is to convince everyone that wooden stakes are primitive superstition. But some people still remember. Some families still recognize the old patterns. Some medical professionals still document evidence they're not supposed to see. And sometimes, late at night in communities where the death clustering has grown too obvious to ignore, people start asking the questions their ancestors asked 3 centuries ago. What if the official explanations are wrong? What if modern medicine is blind to threats that traditional wisdom could see clearly? What if the only way to stop the dying is to remember how our ancestors fought the undead? The answers to those questions might save lives, but they will certainly destroy careers, challenge institutions, and threaten every comfortable assumption we've built our modern world upon. Because the vampires are still here, they're still feeding, and they're getting stronger. Every year we pretend they don't exist. The time for comfortable denial is over. While you've been reading this, while you've been weighing evidence against your modern skepticism, while you've been constructing rational explanations for irrational phenomena, they've been feeding. Tonight, in hospitals across New England, in suburban homes that smell like antiseptic and death, in emergency rooms where doctors shake their heads and write cause unknown on death certificates, the vampires are claiming new victims. And you know what the most damning part is? We're helping them. Every time we dismiss cluster family deaths as genetic predisposition, we give them cover. Every time we classify supernatural visitation reports as grief-induced hallucination, we silence their victims. Every time we suppress research into historical protective measures, we eliminate the only weapons that ever worked against them. Modern medicine has become their greatest ally, not because doctors are complicit, but because the entire system is designed to deny the existence of threats it cannot quantify, patent, or control. We've built the perfect hunting ground for predators that operate outside our accepted understanding of biology, death, and the boundaries between them. Dr. Jennifer Martinez learned this the hard way. In 2021, as Chief of Infectious Diseases at Boston Children's Hospital, she began documenting what she initially classified as pediatric autoimmune clustering in 17 families across Massachusetts. Children dying of unexplained wasting illnesses, siblings following identical symptom progressions, parents reporting nighttime attacks by deceased children. Martinez's documentation followed the same patterns that Sullivan, Brewster, and dozens of other medical professionals had secretly recorded. Unexplained preservation in deceased cluster victims, supernatural visitation reports from surviving family members, correlations between modern death sites and historical vampire burial locations. But Martinez made a fatal mistake. She believed institutional medicine could acknowledge supernatural evidence if presented with sufficient scientific rigor. In December 2022, she submitted a formal research proposal to the National Institutes of Health requesting funding to investigate anomalous disease transmission patterns in historical vampire burial communities. The response was swift and devastating. Martinez was placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. Her research files were confiscated as potential public health hazards. She was diagnosed with occupational stress disorder and forced into early retirement. Her medical license was suspended indefinitely. Martinez died in a single-car accident 6 months later, on a clear day, on a straight road, with no mechanical failure and no evidence of impairment. The accident occurred less than 2 miles from Riverside Cemetery, where 7 of her documented cluster families had buried their victims. Her death sent a message that every medical professional understood perfectly. Investigate vampire activity at your own risk. The modern medical establishment will not tolerate acknowledgement of supernatural threats, regardless of evidence, regardless of effectiveness, regardless of lives that could be saved. But Martinez's death also accomplished something the authorities hadn't anticipated. It galvanized the underground network of medical professionals who had been documenting vampire activity in isolation. Her martyrdom became the catalyst for organized resistance to institutional denial. The network, now calling itself the Traditional Medicine Research Alliance, began sharing data more systematically, coordinating interventions more effectively, and implementing protective measures more boldly. Between 2023 and 2024, they documented successful interventions in 43 cluster family cases using modified vampire burial techniques. Their methods evolved beyond Brewster's early experiments. Dr. Chong in New Hampshire developed environmental purification protocols that combined traditional grave blessing rituals with modern soil treatment techniques. Dr. Foster in Vermont created family protection systems that integrated historical warding methods with contemporary security technology. Dr. Watson in Maine pioneered community immunity programs that used social network analysis to identify and protect potential vampire feeding grounds before outbreaks occurred. The results were unprecedented in modern medical history. Communities that implemented TMRA protocols showed 93% reduction in unexplained death clustering. Families that participated in protection programs survived vampire predation at rates that exceeded any conventional medical intervention. Children in protected households showed complete immunity to supernatural feeding pattern. But success brought scrutiny. Federal health agencies began investigating TMRA activities as potential domestic terrorism related to anti-scientific extremism. State medical boards launched coordinated investigations into practitioners who implemented traditional protective measures. Hospital administrators fired staff members suspected of TMRA collaboration. The crackdown reached its peak in October 2024 when FBI agents raided Dr. Chang's clinic in Portsmouth, confiscating patient files, research documentation, and what they classified as ritual implements. Rowan wood stakes, iron coffin nails, and blessed salt that Chang had used in his environmental purification protocols. Chang was arrested on charges of practicing medicine without scientific basis, endangering public health through superstitious practices, and promoting anti-medical extremism. His trial is scheduled for March 2025, and the outcome will determine whether traditional medicine practitioners can continue their work or will be forced further underground. Meanwhile, vampire activity continues to intensify. The TMRA's final report, published on encrypted networks before the federal crackdown, documents over 800 confirmed cluster family cases in New England during 2024 alone. The numbers represent a 5-fold increase from pre-2020 levels and suggest that vampire populations are experiencing unprecedented growth. The acceleration appears connected to climate change effects on soil chemistry in historical burial grounds. Rising temperatures and changing precipitation patterns have altered bacterial concentrations in vampire burial sites, potentially releasing preservation agents that have kept vampires viable for centuries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys show movement in graves that have been undisturbed since the 1700s. Simultaneously, social isolation during and after the COVID-19 pandemic created ideal feeding conditions for vampires who prey on vulnerable families. Traditional community support systems that once provided protection through collective awareness and mutual aid have been weakened by digital communication, suburban atomization, and institutional dependency. Modern vampires face unprecedented opportunity. Communities with no knowledge of traditional protective measures, medical systems that cannot recognize supernatural threats, and social conditions that isolate victims from potential defenders. They're exploiting our technological sophistication against our spiritual ignorance, but they've also made a crucial mistake. By accelerating their feeding patterns, by growing bolder in their predation, by leaving more obvious evidence of their activity, they've created undeniable proof that traditional communities were responding to real threats with effective countermeasures. The evidence is now too widespread to suppress completely. Too many families have experienced cluster deaths. Too many medical professionals have documented supernatural phenomena. Too many communities have discovered correlations between modern outbreaks and historical vampire burial sites. The institutional denial campaign is beginning to collapse under the weight of accumulated testimony. Social media networks allow families to share experiences that medical authorities would prefer to keep isolated. Independent researchers can publish findings that academic journals refuse to consider. Traditional practitioners can coordinate responses that bureaucratic systems cannot prevent. Most importantly, a new generation is emerging that has grown up witnessing the failure of modern medicine to protect their families from supernatural threats. These young people are not constrained by professional credentialing, institutional loyalty, or scientific orthodoxy. They're learning traditional protective measures from surviving elders, developing new applications of historical techniques, and organizing community responses that bypass official channels entirely. The vampire hunters of 2025 look different from their 1725 predecessors, but they share the same fundamental commitment, protecting their communities from threats that institutions cannot acknowledge or address effectively. They're combining ancient wisdom with modern technology, traditional rituals with contemporary networking, folk knowledge with scientific methodology, and they're winning, not through academic publications or government recognition, but through the same measure that mattered to their ancestors, stopping the deaths when nothing else worked. Every family that implements protection protocols and survives a vampire predation cycle adds evidence to the growing database of traditional medicine effectiveness. Every community that identifies historical vampire burial sites and implements environmental purification measures reduces supernatural feeding opportunities. Every practitioner who documents successful interventions using modified vampire destruction techniques proves that the old ways still work. The vampires thought they had won by convincing modern civilization to abandon supernatural awareness. They believed institutional denial would protect them permanently from community resistance. They assumed technological sophistication would make traditional protective measures irrelevant. They were wrong on all counts. Traditional knowledge survived in fragments, in family stories, in the memories of elders who remembered when communities protected themselves. The suppression was never complete because the threats were never eliminated. And now, faced with vampire activity that exceeds their ability to conceal or control, modern communities are rediscovering the wisdom their ancestors died defending. The choice before us is the same choice that faced the communities of 1725: surrender to inexplicable death patterns that institutional authorities cannot address, or take responsibility for protecting our families through methods that work, regardless of official approval. Our ancestors chose action over authority. They chose observation over orthodoxy. They chose community survival over institutional comfort. And they left us the tools we need, not just wooden stakes and blessed salt, but the courage to trust our own eyes over expert opinions, the wisdom to recognize patterns that officials prefer to ignore, and the determination to act when action becomes necessary. The vampires are still here. They're still feeding, but they're no longer unopposed. The dead don't stay buried when the living refuse to remember how to keep them down. But communities that remember how to drive stakes through the hearts of monsters can still save themselves. The war that began in 1725 continues today. The weapons are the same. The stakes, literally and figuratively, have never been higher. Choose your side carefully, because neutrality in this fight means becoming food for creatures that should have stayed dead centuries ago. And remember, when modern medicine fails, when institutions deny, when authorities suppress, the old ways endure. Stakes through hearts, fire for bones, salt for boundaries, iron for binding. The vampire hunters of 1725 would recognize the battlefield, even if they might not recognize the players. But they would know exactly what needs to be done. The question is, do you have the courage to do it?